I will turn it over to Brianna to get us started.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for being here today. It is wonderful to see everyone back again this year at PTC. As Alan mentioned, I'm going to be taking a closer look at the latest trends in network pricing. And 2024 was certainly a year where we saw a lot of headlines from our telecom world hit the mainstream media, whether it was stories on the evening news about submarine cables as they related to geopolitics, or network outages, or even the potential impact of AI on our world. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a closer look at the actual impact on the market from those headlines in terms of pricing. So first, taking a look at transport pricing, the impact of new submarine cable systems on prices around the world, the price implications of ensuring network diversity and resilience, keeping pace with our ever-growing capacity requirements, looking at 400G pricing, and finally looking at IP transit, established hubs versus the next generation. So submarine cables are always a hot topic, and 2024 was no different. With a number of delayed systems finally coming to fruition to announcements throughout the year, there was a lot of anticipation about what was going to be the impact of this new supply on markets around the world. Well, wavelength prices continued their steady decline throughout 2024, and across key routes, weighted median 100G prices decreased an average of about 11% compounded annually over the past 3 years. Now, how these new network investments are impacting each region does vary significantly. In regions where new high-capacity cables have recently come online, price erosion is accelerating. Here I've mapped out 100G wavelength prices in those dark blue columns versus the CAGR price decline in those red dots. And you can see a variety of trends going on here. For example, in Latin America, which saw the launch of Fermina in 2024, Johannesburg, London, which saw a massive influx of new supply from the launch of Equiano, they're reporting the highest rates of price erosion. In comparison, you can see that routes connecting to and within Asia, where maybe new systems started coming online at the end of the year, or we're still anticipating in 2025, that price erosion is still a little bit slower. And this just takes a closer look at routes connecting to within Asia that were particularly hard hit by the supply chain issues, delays in new systems coming online over the past few years. You can see across the key routes featured here, 100G prices decreased just 5% compounded annually over the past 3 years. Now, this is starting to change a little bit with the launch of Juno in the Pacific in 2024, ADC at the end of the year. We're starting to hear some lower price points out there in the market, so definitely these are routes to watch heading into 2025. But for now, that slower rate of price erosion is helping to maintain or even amplify global price differences. Here I've mapped out 100G wavelength prices relative to London, New York. So London, New York is that dark purple line down there at the bottom. As you can see on routes like Marseille, Singapore, that red line, prices are now about 4.5 times London, New York. That's actually up from 2.7 times the price just 5 years ago. LA, Tokyo there in the yellow, that's consistently hovered between 2 to 3 times the price. In comparison, Miami, Sao Paulo in the pink is now just a little over twice the price of London, New York, down from 4.5 times just 5 years ago. But as we start to see these new systems come online, we do anticipate accelerating price erosion will help narrow these gaps going forward. But we don't expect to ever see a universal price point due to differences in underlying costs or different demand levels across routes, but some narrowing of that gap going forward. And as I mentioned, part of what is fueling accelerating price erosion is that surge in new cable construction. This figure highlights total cable construction costs by region from 2023 to 2027. And those costs are forecasted to reach over $16 billion over the next few years. And if you notice, a lot of that investment is focused on connecting to and within Asia, which we forecast will continue to fuel further price erosion. So this figure is actually from our Transport Networks Forecast Service, and it highlights forecasted 100G wavelength price erosion from year-end 2024 out to 2030. You can see those top routes there: Chennai, Singapore, LA, Singapore, Singapore, Tokyo, Marseille, Singapore. These are routes we've been talking about the past few years. There's been those delays in network supply. There's a lot of new systems coming to fruition. So we're forecasting accelerating price erosion on those routes for sure. Shifting gears slightly and looking at a topic that is top of mind for many here at PTC, ensuring network diversity and resilience, especially with all of the outages in the Red Sea along both coasts of Africa over the past year. There's a lot of discussion about How do we ensure continuity of service in the face of these faults? Well, there are a few ways to approach it. You can look at diversity by route, by supplier or path, by geographic corridor. But all of these strategies do have price implications, so let's take a closer look. Looking first at diversity by route. So here we've highlighted diverse paths on the Trans-Pacific route. Historically, most cables were focused on connecting the US to Japan, and there are still a number of planned projects to do so, but increasingly on the Asian side, we see a diversity of paths, cables connecting the US to Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines. But those do come at a premium price at the moment. Here we've mapped out again 100G wavelength prices on those diverse routes. You can see LA, Singapore there in the middle, still a little over twice the price, LA, Tokyo. Los Angeles, Manila, about 3.6 times the price. And we see a similar thing for pricing for diversity across routes within Asia. Similarly, providers are looking to expand their dependency outside of a single market like Singapore, Hong Kong, or Tokyo. And once again, you're seeing routes to the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia also being thrown out there, but connectivity still does come at a cost. Here we've got 100G wavelength prices again in those dark blue columns versus the CAGR price decline in those red circles. So you can see Mumbai, Singapore, Jakarta, Singapore there in the middle, about 2.3 times the price of Singapore, Tokyo. Hong Kong, Manila, about 3.6 times the price. But these are some of the routes where we're seeing the highest rates of price erosion, which should help narrow that gap going forward. You could also look at diversity by supplier or path, so purchasing capacity on multiple cables within a given route across suppliers. Here we've mapped out the reported range of pricing for 100G waves on Johannesburg, London, in that shaded blue area versus the weighted median price in the red. You can see still a range reported in the market, and prices do vary by provider for a number of reasons. Their regional strength, the customer segment they serve, are they operating on an older or newer submarine cable system? And for Johannesburg, London in particular, how are those cables being routed? Along the east coast of Africa, you may incur expensive cross-connect fees in markets like Djibouti, whereas cables that are routed along the west coast often avoid those fees. They record some of the lowest prices in our range here. And finally, pricing for diversity by geographic corridor. Providers may decide to route their traffic in two entirely different directions around the world to ensure diversity. And we have a slide here that features routes out of India, which is a good example. You have a number of systems going east and west to Asia and Europe. Interestingly, at the end of 2024, 100G wavelength prices on Chennai, Singapore, and Marseille, Mumbai were roughly equivalent. So if you're deciding to split that capacity, there wouldn't be any real price implications. But that isn't always the case. Here we've featured a few routes leaving Australia. So historically, a lot of capacity going towards North America. With the launch of ASC and Indigo a number of years ago, that provided a new geographic routing option up to Asia. And there's certainly price implications here. At the end of 2024, 100G wavelength prices on Sydney, Singapore were about 40% less than LA, Singapore. So certainly a compelling option cost-wise to split that traffic. So a number of strategies if you're looking to ensure network diversity and resilience, but price should be a consideration when taking a look at all of the options. And with bandwidth requirements escalating, launch of new network services is top of mind for many as well. And specifically, we see a number more providers offering 400G service around the world. It's becoming more widely available and a little bit more competitively priced. In fact, providers report that a large portion of their sales pipeline within the US and Europe and across the Atlantic is now for 400G service. We still hear little to no demand within Latin America and Asia. And here we've mapped out 100 and 400G wavelength prices and then that price multiple between the two services in those red circles. So for X times the price, you get 4 times the capacity. The lowest multiples are reported on those shorter terrestrial routes within the US and Europe, here averaging 3.2 times the price. We see higher multiples still on those subsea routes, about 3.9 times the price still. But how individual providers price these services does depend on their emphasis. Here I've mapped out 100 and 400G prices by provider on the Frankfurt, London, and their price multiples there in those red circles. You can see a wide range reported depending on whether a provider has decided to compete more aggressively on 400G or still focusing on the 100G market. The range was about 1.9 times the price to all the way back up to 4. We see a much tighter range, sub-C, a smaller number of providers offering 400G service across the Atlantic. Those multiples range just from about 3.3 to 3.7 times the price for 4 times the capacity. But price multiples don't always tell the whole story. There are additional savings on install, cross-connect, ease of management to be considered that may be compelling factors for customers to upgrade to 400G. And if history is any guide, we will see those price multiples continue to decline over time. This again is from our Transport Networks forecast service, and it highlights 10, 100, and 400G prices on London, New York from year-end 2024 to 2030. So you can see in 2024, there's still a big discrepancy between those prices, but we forecast that to compress out in those outer years. And shifting over to the IP transit world, what is the next big hub is always a popular topic at all of these events, and my colleague John will be definitely talking about that in his portion, but price is a key component when you're looking at what markets would be the next hubs, where should we invest? And connectivity prices for IP transit continue to decline globally, about 13% compounded annually over the past 3 years for 100 gig port prices across key cities. Now, that pace of price erosion does vary significantly by market. There is no universal IP transit price point or price trend. Here we've mapped out 100 gig IP transit port prices in those dark blue columns versus the CAGR price decline. So you can see a range from just 5% in Sydney up to a staggering 41% in Johannesburg. Now, there are a few factors at play here. In hubs such as Singapore, New York, and London, the more moderate rate of price erosion, it's being driven by lower unit costs, higher demand volumes. Whereas in a market like Johannesburg, think back to those wavelength slides, it's driven by reductions in the underlying cost of transport to internet hubs. Also, carriers expanding their network footprints into the market, more venues for local traffic exchange. We're also seeing a similar trend within Asia. Here we featured markets with Singapore as our hub, with also secondary markets within Asia. So you can see there where we're seeing some of the highest rates in price reduction as that underlying cost of transport reduces. Aside from Singapore, all the way there to the left, price erosion range from 23% annually in Seoul to 39% in Jakarta. So definitely some big reductions there. And that's helping narrow the gap within Asia across these markets. Here we've mapped out 10 gig IP transit port prices relative to Singapore. So again, Singapore is that dark purple line there at the bottom. You can see Jakarta in the yellow is now just 2.9 times the price of Singapore compared to about 5 times in 2019. Manila is now just a little over 4 times the price compared to 16 times about just 5 years ago. So definitely some big changes going on within Asia and the Pacific. Within established hubs, you're seeing the rollout of the next generation of services. 100 gig ports are being rolled out across networks and pricing has come into view. Providers still report that this represents a very small portion of their sales mix, think single digits, but it is out there, and port prices average about 2.8 times the price for 4 times the capacity. Again, similar to wavelengths, there is that reduction in install and cross-connect fees, a way to future-proof your network that is appealing for some higher capacity buyers. So a lot of headlines within our world that have made it to the mainstream this year and things to think about heading into 2025 to keep our eyes on for sure. All right, thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to John.
Is it enough to have a new data center being deployed, a major new internet exchange platform or a cloud region, an amalgamation of a number of submarine cables coming into a given market? And if we're thinking about what makes a market a hub, then what makes a hub healthy? What makes it strong? What weakens it? What determines the relative health of a given market? So these are things that I want to consider today as we talk about how we evaluate the strength of interconnection markets. We're going to start with the assertion that the interconnection market is not one homogeneous thing. It's an ecosystem comprised of numerous critically interdependent parts. So once we establish that and establish what we would consider to be very, very key as far as the parts of an interconnection market, we'll do a comparison of individual markets side by side using telegeography's new market connectivity score tool as a diagnostic help. We'll then look at some markets that seem to have impaired development in some way, where we've seen tremendous growth and strength in certain aspects of the market, but perennial lacking in other parts of the interconnection ecosystem and within those locations. And lastly, we'll talk about the lifeblood of any healthy market, which is power. And of course, more critical all the time as we're desperately looking for any source of power these days in the interconnection market. And we'll focus on where we can find sources of clean energy moving forward. So let's start again with this assertion that the interconnection market is made up of critically interconnected parts, much like a body or a machine. And telegeography has a unique take on what comprises these core elements of an interconnection ecosystem based on our unique data sets. So for our purposes today, here they are. To make a strong interconnection market, we would say, of course, that the very basic thing is network, the local and global interconnectedness that holds everything together. The Internet Exchange Platform, which is the traffic intersection for these networks to provision communications. Cloud infrastructure, which delivers content and computing that enables us to do work over network ecosystems. Data centers that provide the housing, power that keeps everything running. And we have to consider some macroeconomic factors as well, such as the economy itself, which generates the traffic over the internet through personal and corporate communication activity. And then last but not least is governance. When we have stable governance, good governance, that provides the stability and the transparency needed to enable an interconnection market to flourish. So let's keep these things in mind as we go through our evaluation of interconnection hubs. These are the things that we would say altogether comprise a healthy interconnection ecosystem. And to use an example, I'm going to take a personal one from my family. My son has a deep, abiding passion for herpetology, which is the study of amphibians and reptiles, and he's kind of dragged all of us into it. So I have a bioactive enclosure. Does anyone know what this is? I have it for my poison dart frogs. So it's basically a self-contained ecosystem in a tank, where the plants provide air quality and shelter for the animals. The substrate soil provides the nurturing that's needed by the organisms and the plants within the ecosystem. You have these little springtails and isopods that are invertebrates that eat the waste and the mold, so you don't have to clean the tank, which is my favorite part. And you have all these various facets that keep everything running together as a single whole. And so if we were to stretch that analogy, we could refer to the interconnection ecosystem as sort of a technoactive ecosystem. All right, so keeping these things in mind, let's talk about some specific relative health comparisons. And to do this, we're going to use telegeography's new market connectivity score platform. And this is a powerful tool that draws data from across our research areas, as well as a few third-party resources, to give a sweeping and a very unique view of the health of interconnection markets. We evaluate according to 9 data categories, pulling from the highlighted general categories that I showed you earlier. We have 43 individual metrics that we use to basically score 3,000 individual metropolitan markets worldwide according to their current health and their projected near-term growth. Just to show you briefly, one of the visuals that we like to use, and you'll see a couple of these today, are polar charts, which are a fantastic way to overlap and compare 2 markets by these broad 9 categories that you see around the circumference, according to their relative strengths and weaknesses. All right, so with that, let's dive into a comparison. I want to compare this grouping of markets right here. It's doing a side-by-side comparison of the two markets in each of a couple of different regions around the globe. These are all markets that have very healthy and growing data center environments where the growth has been at least 10% compounded annually since 2020, and you have at least 1 million square feet of data center space. So just using these as an example, let's do a side by side. And we'll start with the Southeast Asian markets. Again, looking at our polar charts here. Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, pretty similar patterns of strengths and weaknesses, but there are some key differences. Jakarta actually scores ahead of Kuala Lumpur across the infrastructure categories, while Kuala Lumpur comes out ahead when it comes to pricing competitiveness for network pricing and government transparency. The biggest differences between these two markets, according to our scoring system here, is that Jakarta has a much, much larger peering ecosystem with 7 times the number of ASNs connected than Kuala Lumpur. And then on the flip side, Kuala Lumpur has much more competitive pricing for IP transit. However, Jakarta's rates are eroding quite rapidly, which is a major plus for them as well. Turning to a few European markets, again, fairly similar patterns with Berlin and Madrid, with some key differences. Madrid has a much more highly deployed cloud ecosystem with 12 on-ramps, 5 cloud regions, and another one on the way. Madrid also comes out ahead when it comes to power. And here we're scoring specifically clean power, the percentage of power that is clean being used in the market, the amount of power available, the amount coming down the pipeline in terms of clean power generation, with more than 90% of all of its used power being clean. Madrid comes out ahead in that category. Berlin has a very fast-growing data center market, though, and really it edges out Madrid not because of the amount of capacity in place, but because of what's coming down the pipeline in the very near future. With more than 10 major projects actively being constructed right now, Berlin comes out ahead in that category. Actually also comes out slightly ahead when it comes to its internet exchange environment with a higher concentration of local ASNs in that market. A couple of Latin American markets that we've been talking about, Santiago de Chile and Santiago de Querétaro, are also fairly comparable in a number of ways. When it comes to clean power availability, Santiago de Chile comes out ahead. Chile, and that's basically not because of the amount of capacity in place, but because of what's being planned. Chile has more clean power generation projects coming down the pike than Santiago de Querétaro, where there really aren't any major projects happening in the very near term. So that's a key difference there. Chile also comes out ahead when it comes to internet infrastructure with more than 17 terabits of international internet capacity. It's a major international hub. In Mexico, the Mexican market comes out a bit ahead when it comes to its peering infrastructure. The last example I want to talk about in this section is Johannesburg and Cape Town, looking at these two African markets. And here I want to kind of throw in another feature of our platform that really drives home the point that ultimately, we have these scores that are set up, but the relative scores are with both overall and within each category. Ultimately, what really matters is what's important to the user. Whether, depending on whether you're looking at one facet or another, if you're more interested in what's happening in the internet exchange market, that market may be more of interest regardless of how it scores relative to another market in other categories. We can have numerous examples of that, and we'll show one here. So at first glance, Johannesburg clearly comes out ahead as the more mature cloud market in particular. But across this platform, we allow the user to change the weighting in any of the major group categories to determine what's really most important to you in evaluating a market's health. So without changing the weightings, keeping everything equal, Johannesburg comes out a little ahead in its overall score relative to Cape Town. But when we increase the importance of power in our consideration here, the score comes out equal for both. And that's because Cape Town has a tremendous amount of clean energy available in that market. So next I want to turn our attention to how some markets have tremendous strengths in certain aspects of the interconnection ecosystem, but seem to perennially lag in other aspects. It's an interesting aspect of this market that we do. No market is remotely perfect, but some seem to have gaps relative to others in certain ways. So, looking first off at network locations that have tremendous capacity development in transport networks, but don't have as much when it comes to cloud services. So these are all markets that have a lot of international internet capacity. Some of them have tremendous numbers of subsea cables concentrated, but none of them have a lot of cloud deployments going along with that. In fact, no cloud regions for any of these markets, and most of the cloud services are limited to a handful of on-ramps. Excuse me. Then there are markets that have tremendous peering capability, but not a lot of data center capacity. And again, looking specifically here at Helsinki and Sofia as two examples of this, these are markets that have more than 500 ASNs in their, locally peering. More than half of those ASNs are international, but there's not a ton of data center infrastructure supporting that. And then lastly, I want to point out markets that have no major clean power in the pipeline. And this one, of course, becomes really interesting because in this case, and by the way, I should clarify with all these, this is a comparison of scores from the Market Connectivity Score tool, not aggregate capacity. So looking at these overall scores relative to the power scores, here are some markets where there is tremendous strength overall, but not much in terms of clean power availability. And we see this as a particularly big problem in a lot of the most critical APAC markets. So turning lastly to power itself on that note, the very lifeblood that holds it all together, let's look at some places that we do find clean power available. And what I kind of want to drive home here in this section is that we, of course, see a lot of clean power available in markets that you would expect in the Scandinavian markets and places with abundant clean power available and ideal climates. But there is also a lot coming available in places that you wouldn't necessarily consider that would help to promote perhaps interconnection market development and more of a diversity of locations. So these are all markets where at least 80% of the power that's being used is clean energy. In Norway, the number one source of power is hydroelectric. In Spain, in fact, clean energy is almost as widely used as natural gas, which is the primary source. And in Colombia, hydroelectric is the number one source of power in the country. So lastly here, looking at markets that have a lot of clean power coming down the pike in the very near future. What I want to point out here is the stark contrast between the current scores and the future scores, particularly in places like Manila, the Philippines, Fortaleza, Brazil. Excuse me. And there are a couple of Chinese markets represented here: Hangzhou, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen. In China, there's a lot of aggressive development in clean power generation. I want to point out here too that all of our power data in the MCS comes from Global Energy Monitor. So just a quick look here at the end at some of the sources of clean power. In China, it's a very diverse array of sources for clean power generation. There's currently more than a terawatt in operation of clean power, short-term projections to grow that by more than 20%. and hydro is a major source of power development there right now. In the Philippines in particular, I wanted to point out too, there's a lot of investment in solar, and they're in fact working on building what could be the world's largest solar farm in Luzon, and that would be, that's projected to be operating by next year. So again, clean power coming from a number of places, both expected and perhaps unexpected, adding to the potential for healthy market development in new places. So again, to kind of recap, interconnection markets are not one single thing, but ecosystems comprised of very tightly interdependent parts. You can evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different markets using tools like the Market Connectivity Score. Ultimately, those evaluations depend on the facets of the market that are most important to your investments. And as we see power increasingly taking front and center stage when it comes to interconnection market development, we're finding sources of clean energy generation in some intriguing new places, as well as places that we would expect, opening opportunity for new development of connectivity markets around the globe. That's all I have, and now I'm going to turn it over to noted hacker traveler, Alan Malden.
All right. So today I'm going to be talking about Mother Earth, Motherboard. Kind of a weird title, right? Perhaps many of you are aware of an article that science fiction author Neil Stephenson wrote back in 1996 in Wired magazine, in which he kind of follows around the laying of the Flag Europe to Asia cable. It's a great article. You should all check it out. Don't read it now. It's over 40,000 words long, I believe. So for the flight home, it's a good idea. Also, if you can find this exact issue, there's a good article also called AOL, AOK, or DOA. We'll see how that one turns out. But I was kind of captivated by this concept of the Earth as a motherboard. So taking the globe, combining a computer motherboard here with the CPU, the circuits, the storage, all that, to create, this is an image I made with AI. It is an AI-generated image of Mother Earth motherboard. So in my talk, I want to use AI to create some images to help us break apart the sections of this presentation. So have any of you used AI to make an image before? Okay, 2 people, I think, 3. Okay, 4, 5, 6, okay, great. So I want to show you how this works actually. So here's my subsection called Cycles of Renewal. Here's the prompt that I used to make this image. Create an image of the Earth's seasons that ties in to the life cycle of submarine cables, please. You should always use please when talking to the AI. Trust me, it's a good idea. So we get this, the 4 seasons of the Earth with cables, all kinds of cool stuff happening, nice image. So let's look into the topic of submarine cable investment, and looking at 3 different periods here, you can see there is a lot of investment surging into the sector. This most recent period is 2023 to 2027. I think right now we're nearing $17 billion of investment. It's a lot for submarine cables compared to the investment in data centers for AI. It's not that big, but for us, hey, it's a big number. So why are we seeing this level of investment coming into new submarine cables? There's a lot of factors behind this. The most basic factor underlying everything is the demand for bandwidth. It keeps growing, right? It's still growing constantly all the time. But it's more than just demand. Other drivers that are at work here. Some of them include commercial factors. So there is a need to constantly try to reduce costs. You can do that by having higher capacity cables, which give you a lower cost per terabit of capacity. But also there's the issue of, can you even source the capacity you need in the market? If you're someone who wants to have a fiber pair or 2 pairs, even half a pair, can you get that from the cables that are currently in service in the market? You can't sometimes, so building cables is a good idea then to meet the needs for your network. Another factor that's increasingly important is route diversity and resiliency. There's a need to have new novel paths, and I will go into that a bit later in the presentation. And finally, this was mentioned this morning as well, aging cables. Many cables will be reaching the end of their economic lives, and we'll go into that a bit later as well. So all these factors kind of contribute to why we're seeing this large share of new investment coming into submarine cables. So looking at now, not just the absolute dollar amount that's going into new cables, but the types of projects that are being built and who's behind them. So let's take these three periods. Let's break them into some different categories here. So this is a breakdown of the share of investment for these three periods into three groups. The bottom red, that is no hyperscaler involvement. You can see that's been going down. It's now just about 25% of total investment in projects have no involvement of these companies. The turquoise share there, that is consortium joint builds with at least one of the hyperscalers involved. And the dark blue there, that is private hyperscaler cables. Hyperscalers that I'm including here, the four companies shown here on that list, but it's mainly Google and Meta who are doing the vast majority at this stage. It's important to bear in mind that red category, that is no hyperscaler involvement. That doesn't mean those companies have not acquired pairs, once the cable has been entered service or have bought capacity as well. So this is just the initial investment happening in cables. But this is the global picture. Let's go, kind of into some different regions to see how it varies. So let's first look at the Atlantic. What we see here is a big shift, right? You can see there's really no cables in the 2023-2027 period that have no hyperscaler involvement. And the big shift here is the very swift and strong swing towards private hyperscaler cables built by Google and Meta. So in contrast, let's look now at the Transpac and Oceania. Here we saw the involvement of hyperscalers in cables like Unity, even back in the 2010, 2015 timeframe. But in the recent period here, we can see also a very strong shift towards cables that are just pure private hyperscaler cables. Heavily Google's Pacific Connect projects are included here. Also Meta as well with the Orca system. So let's visualize some of these investments a bit here. Let's look at Google's cables that are the publicly disclosed cables where they are either building it themselves or part of a consortium. You can see the cables shown here. Now, note, this is not Google's global network. This is just the cables where they are publicly known to have invested in. They certainly have pairs on other cables, have capacity on some systems as well. But you can see that it's a pretty global network, right? It's reaching many different continents, going around the globe. And in contrast, let's look at Meta's network of what they have announced. It's far different. It's a more US-centric network. Heavy focus here on Transpac cables and transatlantic cables. There are some exceptions here. There's the Malbec cable, there's to Africa, right? But it's heavily focused on these oceans coming back to the United States. So what does this mean for the market? So what are the implications here? Well, it's always worth noting, people sometimes get worried, these are private cables, I can't use them. No, you can get access to these cables too. These companies are often willing to swap pairs. They will sell IRUs sometimes for pairs or partial pairs. Also, carriers can partner with hyperscalers to have branches built into the trunks of these cables as well. So there is a role for carriers to play, to work alongside the hyperscalers to build out their networks. But I think overall, trying to build a cable without the involvement at all of a hyperscaler these days, it's pretty challenging. You can still see it on some niche routes, but overall, it's increasingly rare to have that happen. And finally, carriers do still have a role to play in some parts of the world, especially where there is a less open regulatory or investment environment. Middle East, Africa, sometimes you need to have carriers as the landing parties or to have a certain percentage ownership in the cables. So there is not just hyperscaler only, there are carriers playing a role here. So next, let's look at the issue of cable retirements. And so I made this chart here which shows cables that are in their 20th year of service or more. They're color-coded by route region. So you can see the Atlantic, Pacific, I think it's Latin America there, intra-Asia, and a few more. There's a lot of cables in this for some of these. Like in Latin America here, you're looking at there's 6, 7 cables that are in their 25th year of service right now. So that partially explains why you're seeing so many new cables being built in that region. Now, Once cables reach 25 years, do they stop working immediately? No, right? That is just the minimum design life for cables. Some will go beyond the 25-year period. Some already have. You can see here, a few of them have popped kind of over that level already. But I think it's probably fair to say that by the end of this decade, the vast majority of these cables shown here will be turned off, okay? Which is why we're seeing the investment. And it's not just to replace these cables' capacity, which is often on the smaller side. These cables offer unique routes. The landings maybe they land in maybe a spot where only 1 or 2 cables currently land. So you need to have new cables to ensure enough route diversity exists in these markets. All right, the next section break here with an AI image. A resilient system. So this prompt I used was create an image that combines Mother Earth with a resilient global cable network, please. Okay, let's use a globe, not a human body, please. Keep this polite here. That's more like it, okay. The Earth being wrapped tightly in a band of submarine cables, that's good. Okay. So on the topic of route diversity here, let's look at what's happening in a few parts of the world. In the Atlantic here, let's look at cables that are currently in service but built before 2015. Really interesting clustering here, the landings on the North American side around the New York, New Jersey area, right? On the European side of things, you can see heavy focus in UK and Northwest France. Let's see what's happened since then. This is pretty interesting. For cables built since then, plus planned cables, look at this nice split on the North American side. From Canada down to Virginia Beach to Myrtle Beach, you have lots of new landing areas spaced very nicely there. And on the European side, something similar has happened. You're seeing new landings, Portugal and in Spain and Norway, west coast of Ireland, right? You still see cables going to the UK, of course, and to New York and New Jersey as well. But there's been a nice increase in the diversity on the Atlantic. Looking at the Pacific now, how does that look? We can see here for cables that are still in service that were built before 2017 here, heavy Japan focus, no surprise there. The one cable that's not, that's the AAG cable. On the North American side, it's not quite as clustered as it is in the Atlantic. You see a bit of focus more on Southern California and Oregon. So let's go now to the more current period. Since 2017, including planned cables, we see this. Cables to Japan still happening, yes, but increasingly direct cables to Singapore, Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia. And on the North American side, Canada with the Topaz cable down to Mexico. Some new landings in California of note, in San Diego, Manchester, Eureka. So we're seeing improvement right now in a lot of the diversity on these single routes. But diversity is not a matter of just having a bunch of different cables that serve a single route. It's a matter of using multiple different geographic corridors to complete a network. And so Brianna mentioned this before with pricing, but we have diversity in terms of corridors as well. And two cases that I wanted to highlight here I think are probably the most interesting for having diversity through corridors is India, where you see lots of cables extending both directions to Singapore and then west to Europe. This was incredibly important this past year with the multiple cable faults in the Red Sea. Operators were able to add a lot more capacity heading east to offset the loss of these cables until they were repaired. Australia is a very interesting case here. If you go back 10, 15 years ago, heavily focused on cables going from the East Coast to the US. There's a few exceptions as well. But you can see now a lot of different cables, different directions, east, north, west, and multiple paths being built to different locations from Australia. So it definitely has a very interesting mix, not just in multiple cables and where the cables land, but in how they're heading and going through different corridors. Now, looking at maps doesn't really show you the full picture of diversity, right? Maps are just showing the connectivity, which countries are linked, where the cables land. It does not show the capacity of the cables. They're all different, as we know. Some are smaller capacity, some are higher capacity. But not just that, it doesn't show how operators have deployed capacity across the cables, which is a lot different here. Here I have the Middle East. You might think, wow, this is great. Cables are going to Europe, they're going south to Africa, they're going to India. It's very diverse. But according to our data, we think that about 82% of the region's international capacity is going to Europe, right? So the picture of diversity here is a bit misleading. You can't look at just a map. You look at how capacity is being deployed. All right, let's go to another AI image here. The fun part of the presentation, right? So global climate change. So what I did here was I asked AI to create an image that ties in climate change to the pace of bandwidth demand growth, please. Wow. The Earth is on fire. It's going to crack apart because of demand. It's overheating. 37% is a number there for some reason. I don't know what that means. But unfortunately, the reality is we're not seeing an overheating. We're seeing global cooling, right? So this is a chart showing the annual pace of growth of used international bandwidth since 2010. You can see in the last 5 years, it's been steadily slowing. It's gone below 40% a while ago, and the most current period, it was just below 30%. Now you may think, well, this is the global total. Of course, it's small because it's slowing in the big markets, and surely in the more smaller markets, it's growing much faster. It hasn't slowed yet, right? Well, let's look at that. Let's look and see, looking at the different regions of the world, are we seeing global cooling? And we are. Looking at these 3 CAGR periods I've created here, the most recent period is 2020 to 2024, that red bar. And you can see it's gone down for every region except for one. Latin America is a little bit higher than the previous period, but both those bars there, the 2015 to 2019 and 2024 are already much lower than the previous bar. So widespread global deceleration of international bandwidth demand growth. So the next question logically is, why are we seeing this, right? So let's answer that question. When we ask operators who provide to us data on their network growth and the deployment of capacity, what's been going on, the most common response to this is we localized more in the past year. We were able to keep more the content applications, the compute local. We connect more to internet exchanges in our region. Cloud came to us now. We don't have to connect to the cloud remotely. Becoming more and more in region, which does play a role in slowing the growth of bandwidth of international demand. Doesn't stop it, it's just slowing it, okay? Submarine cable delays was cited by some operators as a reason they didn't deploy as much as they wanted to. So this could mean perhaps that in the coming years, as cables are finally completed, we could see at least a temporary surge in demand growth for some routes when these cables enter service. But one other aspect that we hear a lot from companies who are really new to building their networks out, like a cloud operator, a CDN, when they enter a new market, they often go in really big. You know, they need to ensure they can provide a high level of service. They might come in and put in 4 paths of 400 gigs. That's 1.6 terabits. That sounds huge to some of these markets. They'll put that in initially, and then once they have enough scale, diversity achieved, they wait until it starts to grow, until it fills up. That may take a while, so growth kind of slows in the interim period. So you do see a spike sometimes in some markets when they get a new cloud region or some operator puts in a bunch of new compute and storage in there. And finally, kind of a heuristic here, which is the law of large numbers, which is something that is growing at a rapid pace cannot grow at that rate forever. I mean, if we were still seeing bandwidth demand growth of 80, 90%, we'd be in trouble. You can't build cables fast enough to meet that kind of growth, right? So slowing demand is a natural part of the industry, I believe. So let's not get too sad here, because slower growth, it leads to massive volume still, okay? You know, we're below 30% globally in the most recent year. That's still huge. So let's look at our forecasts of international bandwidth demand growth to 2030. And you can see here, for those regions again, the compound annual growth rate that I've shown here. Now with the y-axis, I did something kind of unique. I didn't just put increments of 10, 20, 30%. I put some weird numbers in here. I put 38, 35, 31. Now, why did I do that? I want to put in numbers that correspond to the X-fold increase of demand. So you can see here, if something is growing at 20%, at a compound annual growth rate of 20% for this period of 2024 to 2030, that would be a threefold increase. If it's 38%, that's a sevenfold increase, right? So looking here at, let's say, Asia, 32% CAGR the next 6 years, yeah, that's a mere quintupling of bandwidth connected to Asia, right? So you often get confused when you hear these growth rates and how they, what the impact that compounding has in the overall scale of the bandwidth. And the numbers are massive. So let's look at the actual terabits, petabits we're going to need in the next six years. So this is the incremental required for these regions. You can see here for Asia, 5.2 petabits of additional capacity coming from 2024 to 2030. Okay, evolution. The next AI prompt here is to let's create an image that ties in Mother Earth as a motherboard and the rise of AI. Oh, wow. You know what? I know what happened here. I didn't say please. See, if you don't say please, it gets very dystopian and very creepy in a hurry. So you got to be careful, okay? So AI is one of the hottest topics, I think, at the conference and in society overall, and how that's going to impact international networks. And the truth is, when we talk to people about AI, no one really knows what it's going to mean for long-haul networks. People can guess and think this or that, but there's no, I can't tell you it's going to lead to X% more bandwidth growth over X years. That is unknown at this stage. What we can do is discuss what are some of the factors in terms of how AI works that could influence the pace of bandwidth growth. Let's look at some of these. So one is model training locations. Training is generally done in areas that have large amounts of power available, given the huge power requirements. They're less latency sensitive in terms of they don't have to be near to the large users. The model is trained anywhere. Once the model is trained, you can send the model then down to a local inference cluster and be used locally, but it can be trained anywhere in the world that has enough power. So second, inference. Inference, in case you're not aware, but that is more using an AI model to perform whatever task you have assigned to that model. And this is generally performed on cloud-based clusters or even on a device. You can do some inferencing on your iPhone of some level, depending on how power intensive and complicated the requirement is. In this case, for inference, it's often better if there's a reduced distance between where the inferencing is done and the user is. So that does play a role in long-haul bandwidth, of course, because if the inferencing is done more locally, that's less going over long-haul networks potentially. Other factors here are the way AI works and some of the techniques that are being deployed that can govern how it works. So a few of these are distributed training and federated learning, which is breaking apart training into different locations. That's being explored. I have no idea if it's going to be viable in the future or not, but that would have some implications to the data sent between these training clusters. Another factor here, which we haven't really looked at, is not just AI as a driver, but how can AI be used actually for data compression, for traffic routing? Could AI be used in ways that actually limit the amount of bandwidth that is going over international? Something to consider there. Spatial temporal load shifting, a nice long expression that means the ability to move workloads around between different data centers to optimize for power and processing availability. Google does this quite a bit. Other companies may opt to do this. To do this, you need to have a large network to accommodate this, right? So clearly being able to take advantage of a geographically diverse set of data centers requires a very geographically dispersed network as well to support that. And finally, this is becoming a really big issue, legal issues. Just in the last 2 weeks in the US, there were some announcements about this. Export controls, which countries can get access to, and the volume they can get access to of the most advanced AI chips. And that could play a role in which countries emerge as locations that are doing a lot of model training. Also, data sovereignty. There's over 100 countries that have rules and laws that govern where data can be stored and processed. So that's going to have some impact if data can be taken out of a country and trained on a cluster in a different country or region possibly. So let's consider now, back to my topic of Mother Earth as a motherboard. And here's a map I created showing existing and planned submarine cables, existing and planned cloud data centers. You're starting to see things taking shape here. This could be kind of a circuit board happening, right? But let's close this up with a look at the future. And one last AI-generated image here. But here I opted to ask HI. Do you guys know what that is? That's human intelligence, okay? I asked human intelligence, please create a final image for my Mother Earth motherboard presentation in the style of the movie Blade Runner. Pretty tough prompt, right? Well, we somehow did it. This is our new submarine cable map. It's going to be released, I think, tomorrow. So that's what human intelligence is capable of still. That's all I have. Thank you very much. Thanks for attending.